Welcome to the Boring History for Sleep channel, your passport to the past, but on a slow train where time itself yawns and takes a nap. Here we gently unravel forgotten stories from history with a calm voice and an unhurried rhythm until words themselves tuck you into bed and your spirit finds rest. Get ready for a peaceful night and a deep, cozy sleep. Long, long ago, so far back that even human memory feels embarrassed to remember, Earth breathed slowly, and little villages napped within nature's arms. Life moved at such a tranquil pace it was as if the days were just threads spun by the wind. Homes were scattered across green meadows, built from mud and stone, crowned with golden straw roofs that shimmered under the first rays of the sun. Tall trees stood guard outside each house, their branches swaying with the morning breeze, while birds whispered softly like distant secrets in the open air. Forget asphalt highways. There were only soft dirt trails carrying the lazy footprints of travelers and the squeaky wheels of wooden carts filled with yesterday's harvest. In the distance, wheat fields stretched endlessly, glowing gold before harvest, glowing green in spring when new shoots sprouted. The air carried the sweet smell of damp earth after dewy nights, warmer and kinder than any bustling city could ever offer. The wind here wasn't wild. It strolled in gently like a messenger from distant seasons. It brushed across the hills, hummed over the straw rooftops, and sang a lullaby without words. And then, somewhere in the stillness, a little bell echoed from a wooden tower at the edge of the village. Its slow, deep chime didn't rush anyone. It simply announced, "Good morning." But hey, no need to hurry. The sun climbed lazily into the sky, smoke curled gently from stone hearths, and the smell of freshly baked bread drifted out like an invitation. This simple world didn't know noise, didn't chase the ticking of clocks. Days stretched wide like a page of peace, and nights descended softly like silk, wrapping the village in silence. Life was plain, yes, but full of peace, like a quiet song sung by the earth itself. The houses of that time were as humble as their owners, gentle, modest, and firmly rooted in the earth they stood upon. Their walls were built from mud mixed with straw, strong enough to shield from the cold of winter, yet soft enough to breathe in the heat of summer. On their roofs, bundles of straw were stacked carefully, layer by layer, until from afar they looked like golden hats resting quietly beneath the wide open sky. The doors were heavy slabs of wood, shut with small iron latches hammered out by the village blacksmith, a man who probably thought he was crafting security systems, medieval edition. Windows were few and tiny, just big enough to let in a little daylight or the fresh smell of rain. Inside there was no luxury, no decoration, just tamped earth floors or raw wooden planks and low ceilings where ropes sometimes hung, drying herbs, garlic, or onions. In one corner, a small stone hearth slept with a fading ember inside, still warm from last night, waiting patiently for the morning spark to bring it back to life. Nearby, clay pots in earthy tones stored water, grains, and flour. On the rough walls leaned simple tools, sickles, woven baskets, maybe even an old hunting bow that had seen better days. Step outside, and in the front yard you'd probably see a chicken coop, a shallow well that collected rainwater, and a stone trough where livestock could drink. Children spent their early hours of the day here, playing with pebbles, chasing butterflies, and generally proving that you don't need iPads to have fun. These houses stood close to one another, separated only by wooden fences or tiny vegetable patches, like a family of siblings living side by side. By evening, when smoke rose from every hearth, the entire village looked like a single living creature, breathing softly under the sunset. Inside these small homes, stories were born, secrets whispered, and lives carried on in the warm simplicity of a world that knew peace, broken only by the whinny of a passing horse or the bark of a dog guarding the village edge. When night was about to loosen its grip, dawn in the Middle Ages arrived shyly, like a polite guest, knocking softly on the village gates. The sky was painted greyish-blue, with fading stars making their quiet exit. Mist drifted slowly across the fields, covering them like a giant wool blanket, while drops of dew trembled on the leaves, catching the first hints of light like tiny pearls. The roosters were the village alarm clocks, crowing loud enough to echo through every alleyway, followed by the low moo of cows impatient for milking and the restless neigh of a horse in a nearby stable. Then came the sound of a bell, small, slow, and steady, ringing from the wooden church tower in the square. Its tone wasn't rushed or urgent. It was more like saying, "Wake up, folks, a brand new day is here, but let's take it slow." Inside the houses, women moved quietly across earthen floors, opening heavy wooden doors that creaked softly. Cold morning air rushed in, and soon the hearths came alive again. A woman in a simple wool dress would brush aside the ashes to uncover last night's ember, coaxing it back to flame with thin sticks. Her breath mixed with the faint crackle of twigs until the fire flared suddenly, blooming into warmth and light. The smell of oak or pine filled the room, mingling with the scent of fresh dough being kneaded for bread. Outside, farmers stepped onto the misty paths with calm determination, wooden tools slung over their shoulders. They waved silent greetings to one another before heading into the fog-drenched fields, their footsteps muffled by wet grass. Donkeys and mules pulled creaking carts along muddy roads, their hooves striking the ground with a rhythm as steady as a lullaby. Morning back then wasn't just the start of work, it was a sacred pause, a moment of clarity before the heavy demands of the day. Nature whispered a gentle tune that only those living in such distant times could truly hear. Time itself seemed to stretch lazily under the faint rays of the rising sun, as if even the universe wasn't in a hurry. With the first strands of dawn, the heart of every house came back to life, the hearth. In the dim corner, a pile of dry wood waited faithfully from the night before. A woman in her simple wool dress would kneel, brush the ashes aside, and reveal a faint ember still glowing from yesterday. She'd lay down twigs as thin as fingers, then blow gently until sparks leapt up like tiny stars. Suddenly the fire blossomed, a burst of light and warmth, carrying with it the familiar aroma of oak or pine. Every house knew that smell. It was the scent of safety. Above the fire, a small clay pot filled with clear water was set to warm, ready for a brew of dried wild herbs. Beside it, dough rested on a wooden board, slowly transforming into bread with a golden crust. Fire wasn't just for cooking, it was the pulse of the home, the gathering place, the anchor of peace. Around it, children warmed their little hands, stories were told in the evenings, and winter's bite was kept at bay. Even neighbors could tell who was awake by the thin trails of smoke rising into the cold sky, a silent village language that said, "Yes, life is stirring here." As the sun climbed a little higher, the fields began to reveal themselves in their quiet beauty. Green stretched out like an ocean, shifting gently with every breath of wind. Tall stalks of wheat and barley glittered with dew, while tiny wildflowers, purple, yellow, white, sprang up at the edges, unnoticed by most but radiant for those who paused to look. Birds flew low, searching for food, their calls scattering like notes across the morning air. Farmers entered the field slowly, setting down their wooden tools, pressing their hands into the soil to check its moisture, nodding in approval at the sprouting crops. There was no shouting here, no loud machinery, only the whispers of the wind and the soft rustling of wheat. Before the noon sun bore down, these fields were more than farmland. They were sacred, a meeting place between earth and sky, where life felt both simple and abundant. And then came breakfast, a meal small but rich with comfort. On a low wooden table in the center of the room sat slices of dark bread, baked overnight until its crust turned crisp while its heart stayed soft. A dish of fresh cheese, white as morning milk, accompanied it, along with a clay cup of warm milk still carrying the scent of the cowshed. No one talked much, just the quiet sounds of chewing, the warm smell of bread, and the faint clink of a wooden spoon stirring hot herbal tea by the hearth. Every bite was slow, every sip an unspoken thank you to the land. When the meal ended, farmers rose to the fields, hunters slung their bows toward the forests and rivers, and the fire kept burning for those who stayed behind. That breakfast wasn't just food, it was a quiet bond between humans and the world around them, a humble beginning to a long, steady day. By the time the sun had climbed a little higher, the small village market began to wake up. It wasn't a grand bazaar, just a wide dirt square surrounded by simple wooden huts and carts that had rolled in from neighboring villages. They carried fresh vegetables, baskets of fruit, maybe even a few jars of honey or bundles of herbs tied together with twine. The air was alive with a quiet music, soft voices of vendors calling out their goods, the slow clop of donkey hooves, and occasionally the burst of laughter from a child darting between stalls. From ropes strung between posts hung dried herbs, their sharp fragrance mingling with the warm smell of newly baked bread. One corner had honey in clay jars, another held salt from distant lands, and yet another displayed coarse but brightly coloured fabrics. Merchants ran their hands over the cloth as if to prove its worth, smiling with a pride that said, "See, we don't need Paris fashion shows, we got this." Even though the market was about trade, it didn't have the chaos of city bazaars. It buzzed gently, like the hum of bees. People spoke in low voices, greeting each other before exchanging goods, never rushing. Even the animals tied nearby, cows, goats, and donkeys, chewed grass in patient silence, blending into the calm rhythm of the day. By noon, the market grew busier, more voices, more movement, but still no madness. It was as if the whole place had agreed to live in slow motion. The square itself felt like the village's beating heart, steady, calm, and full of life. Around the edges, workshops added their own rhythm. In one corner, the blacksmith hammered iron on stone, not in a furious clamour, but in a slow, steady beat, like the earth's own heartbeat. Sparks danced briefly, then vanished into the cool air. Nearby, the carpenter caressed oak planks before carving them, the rasp of his tools sounding almost like a whisper. His chisels and hammers hung neatly on the wall like trusted old friends. Not far away, the potter's wheel turned lazily, while his hands shaped clay into vessels, humble jars for water, bowls for stew. What looked like ordinary work was, in truth, a quiet choreography of patience, skill, and devotion. These trades weren't just jobs, they were ways of life. Every tool, every crafted piece carried the weight of human effort, linking people to the earth that had given the raw material. And that's why villages like these lived in quiet self-sufficiency, rarely needing anything from beyond their borders. By mid-morning, herds began leaving their pens for the pastures. Cows with brown or white coats walked slowly, their bells chiming in a steady rhythm. Sheep grazed with lowered heads, while nimble goats climbed nearby slopes in search of tender leaves. The pastures themselves looked like a painting, green hills sprinkled with yellow flowers, bordered by tall trees standing like watchful guardians. The air smelled of damp soil, mixed with the warm, earthy scent of the animals. Shepherds followed at a distance, whistling softly or signalling with a stick. Sometimes one would sit on a flat stone, gazing at the sky or at the village in the distance, while the animals grazed in perfect harmony. When the sun grew warmer, the herd gathered under trees or near streams, their reflections shimmering in still water. It was a daily scene, so simple, yet so whole, life in harmony without hurry or tension. a reminder that in those days man and nature weren't separate. They were parts of the same slow, steady heartbeat. Beyond the fields, where farmland faded into thick forests, another world unfolded, the world of the hunters. The silence there was broken only by the rustle of leaves in the wind or the distant call of a bird. Hunters moved quietly through the tall grass and shadowy trees, carrying bows strung with animal sinew, short spears with polished metal tips, and hand-woven nets folded neatly over their shoulders. Hunting wasn't sport, it wasn't luxury, it was survival. Yet it was done with a sense of respect, never reckless or wasteful. The hunters advanced with measured steps, pausing often to listen, to watch. A broken twig, a faint footprint in the soil. Every sign mattered. By day, rabbits and young deer were the usual prize. Near rivers and ponds, nets slipped silently into the water, waiting with patience that city folk today would never endure. At dawn or just before sunset, when the air was cold and the light turned golden, the forest grew especially still. A hunter might stand motionless for minutes on end, blending into the trees until the birds forgot he was there. Then came the moment, a swift arrow, a silent strike, a life taken, not in cruelty, but in necessity. When enough was gathered, the hunters returned home, slowly, carrying the day's meal, grateful to nature for her gift. Fishing, too, was more ritual than task. In the early hours, rivers mirrored the colors of the sky, their waters so clear you could see pebbles on the bottom. Fishermen sat on smooth rocks or waded barefoot into the shallows, holding nets of flax thread or long poles tipped with small hooks. They dropped bait with quiet precision, the only sound being the gentle ripples of the curry. Water birds drifted lazily nearby, and sometimes a heron stood on the muddy bank, watching as if supervising the scene. Fishermen stared into the water, waiting for the faint tug of a fish. A silver flash broke the surface, twisting in the morning light, then landed in a wet wooden basket. Slowly, patiently, the baskets filled, not with excess, but with just enough to feed. Back in the village, the catch was cleaned carefully, cooked over the fire with a handful of herbs, filling the room with the comforting blend of river and earth. Fishing wasn't about noise or speed, it was about rhythm, patience, and balance. As if the river itself had conspired with humans to keep life steady and sufficient. The rivers of the Middle Ages weren't just water, they were lifelines, silver veins winding through valleys and plains. Their banks were lined with willows and oaks, branches dipping low into the current like curtains of green. People came at sunrise to fill clay jars with drinking water or to wash clothes on flat stones, the sound of fabric slapping in rhythm with the flow. Children skipped pebbles across the surface, laughing as ripples spread wide in the still morning air. At sunset, rivers became mirrors reflecting orange skies, and at night they glittered with stars like lanterns scattered across the earth. The river was never just a river, it was rest, reflection, and renewal. A place where life paused to breathe, and people remembered that peace was possible. Life in the Middle Ages moved in step with the rhythm of the seasons, as if nature itself held the clock. Spring was the earth's awakening. Meadows burst with tiny yellow and purple flowers, birdsong filled the branches, and farmers guided their ploughs through the damp soil, planting seeds with quiet hope. Children ran barefoot in the fields, chasing one another, while the air carried the sweet smell of wet earth and new beginnings. Spring wasn't just a season, it was a promise. After every winter, life returns. Summer came blazing but generous. The sun lingered high in the sky, ripening fruit in orchards and turning wheat fields into golden seas. Work was heavy, yes, but evenings brought relief. Families gathered under trees or by rivers, enjoying nights lit with endless stars. the laughter of neighbours mixed with the chirping of crickets, and suddenly even hard labour felt lighter. Autumn meant harvest, the grand finale of the year's effort. Leaves turned red and orange, falling gently as if writing thank-you notes to the soil. Villagers filled granaries with grain, strung up dried fruit, and baked loaves that smelled of warmth and abundance. The whole village carried the aroma of bread, wood smoke, and gratitude. And then came winter, silent and stern. Fields rested under snow, and so did people. Families huddled around fireplaces, telling old tales and knitting wool garments. Yes, the cold bit hard, but inside the stone houses, firelight and voices softened the edges of the season. Winter wasn't just hardship, it was a pause, a reminder that rest is part of life's cycle. Through all this, life wasn't measured in minutes or deadlines, but in sowing and reaping, in warmth and cold, in the patience of waiting and the joy of gathering. The seasons didn't rush, and neither did the people. Every so often, when the calendar or the priest's bell announced it, the village would gather for the big market day. Unlike the quiet daily trading in the square, these fairs felt almost like festivals. People came from neighbouring villages, carts rattled along dirt roads, and the square swelled with colours, voices and smells that mingled into one vivid memory. Stalls popped up in rows, covered with rough cloth or straw canopies. There were baskets of apples and pears shining under the sun, bundles of onions tied together like strings of beads, pots of honey so golden they looked like melted sunlight. You could hear the bleating of goats brought for sale, the clink of metal tools, the rustle of fabric being unfolded and proudly displayed. The air itself was a blend of sensations, the sharp scent of dried herbs, the sweetness of fruit, the smoky tang of grilled meat being cooked right there in the open. Children darted between the stalls, sticky with honey or clutching a fresh piece of bread, while old men leaned on their sticks, bargaining with the kind of patience only age can afford. The market wasn't just about buying or selling, it was the village's stage, the place where news travelled faster than the wind. A traveller might arrive with spices from afar or stories of distant wars. A minstrel might sit on a barrel, plucking a lute, and singing tales that carried half-truths but whole entertainment. Neighbours who hadn't spoken for weeks exchanged greetings, promises, or the occasional gossip. By midday, the whole square pulsed like a living heart. Slow, steady, yet full of life. Trade was simple: a sack of grain for a bundle of wool, a jug of milk for a basket of apples. Coins were few, but trust was plentiful. Every handshake, every nod of agreement carried weight, binding people not just in economy, but in kinship. As the sun sank, carts rolled home, their wooden wheels creaking under the weight of goods. Dust rose on the roads, and the market square slowly emptied, leaving only footprints, scraps of hay, and the faint echo of laughter. For a while, silence returned, but everyone knew it wouldn't be long before the next gathering, the next slow, joyful heartbeat of the village. At the centre of almost every village stood a modest church, built of rough stone, with a wooden bell tower that looked more humble than grand. It wasn't the towering cathedrals of great cities, but for villagers it was the heart of faith, the anchor of time, and the place where silence carried more weight than words. The bell rang out each morning, not with urgency, but with calm assurance. Its deep, steady tone drifted across fields and forests, reminding everyone, life is fleeting, but the spirit endures. People gathered there not only on Sundays, but on feast days, weddings, baptisms, and farewells. The church wasn't just a building, it was the book of memory written in stone and echo. Inside, the air smelled of wax and wood smoke. Candles flickered like small stars along the walls, their light falling gently across simple wooden benches. A cross stood at the front, unadorned but powerful, while painted icons or faded murals told stories in silence to those who could not read. Every whisper, every prayer seemed to sink into the stone itself, as if the walls remembered. Priests were not just religious guides, but also keepers of knowledge. They read from books few could understand, preserved old tales, and marked the passing of the seasons with their chants. To many villagers, their voices were the rhythm of eternity itself. Faith colored every aspect of life. Before sowing seeds, farmers made the sign of the cross. Before setting out to hunt, hunters whispered a prayer for safety. Before bread was eaten, it was blessed. Festivals blended the sacred and the simple. Processions with candles wound through muddy streets. Hymns rose into the cold night air, and children ran beside, not fully understanding, but sensing the solemn joy of it all. The church stood not as a monument of stone, but as a constant companion. When storms raged, when winters froze, when fields failed, people turned toward its bell tower, and in its shadow they felt less alone. Life in the village wasn't only toil and prayer. Every now and then the still rhythm of days was broken by celebration, festivals that painted the simple life with color, sound, and joy. On feast days the square transformed. Colorful banners fluttered in the wind. Long tables were set with bread, cheese, roasted meat, and clay mugs of ale or mead. Music filled the air. Fiddles squeaked cheerfully, drums thumped like a heartbeat, and wooden flutes carried melodies that seemed older than memory itself. Villagers clapped, sang, and sometimes danced in circles until the dust rose beneath their feet. Children played their own games on the sidelines, rolling hoops of wood, racing with sticks, or chasing each other until they collapsed in laughter. Even the elders, usually stern, would allow themselves a slow smile, watching the young remind everyone that life was more than work. There were contests too. Men tried their strength with log lifting, wrestling in the dirt, or archery matches where arrows thudded into straw targets. Women competed in weaving or bread baking, each loaf judged not only by its taste, but by the way it carried warmth into the air. The winners were rewarded not with riches, but with cheers, bragging rights, and maybe an extra jug of ale. As night fell, bonfires lit up the square. Sparks flew into the darkness while music grew wilder, faster. Shadows danced on the walls, laughter echoed into the fields, and for a moment, the weight of life's hardships was forgotten. Under a sky blazing with stars, the whole village became one voice, one song, one heartbeat. These festivals weren't distractions, they were reminders that even in a world of toil there was space for joy, for laughter, for the simple magic of being alive together. When the sun slipped below the horizon and shadows stretched across the fields, the village retreated indoors. Outside, silence thickened, broken only by the howl of a distant wolf or the creak of the wind through the trees. But inside, around the glowing hearth, life pulsed softly in words. Families gathered close to the fire, its light painting their faces in gold and amber. Children curled at their parents' feet, their eyes wide, their minds already half in dreams. And then the stories began. They weren't read from books, few could read. They lived in memory, passed from mouth to ear, from one generation to the next, like treasures carried on the breath. Tales of ancient heroes who fought dragons and spirits in dark forests, legends of saints who healed with a touch, or tricksters who outwitted greedy lords. Some stories were so old that no one remembered their beginning, yet they carried the weight of truth simply because they were told again and again. Every voice around the fire was a thread weaving the fabric of memory. Sometimes a grandmother's cracked voice trembled as she recounted hardships of winters long past. Sometimes a father spoke of his own youth, when rivers ran clearer, when harvests were richer. Children listened, half believing, half dreaming, while sparks from the fire floated upward like stars escaping through the chimney. These stories were more than entertainment. They were maps of identity, compasses of morality, anchors of belonging. In them, people found courage, laughter, warnings, and hope. They were the village library, carried not in ink, but in breath, flickering like the fire itself, fragile yet enduring. And when the last tale ended, silence returned. Only the fire crackled, slowly collapsing into glowing embers. Outside, the world was vast and dark, but inside, words had built a shelter, stronger than stone. As the fire dimmed and the last words of stories faded into silence, night truly claimed the village. Outside, the fields disappeared beneath a silver veil of moonlight. The wind softened, the trees whispered slower, and the earth itself seemed to exhale in relief. Houses closed their wooden doors with a dull thud, shutters were pulled tight against the cold, and only thin trails of smoke still curled from chimneys before vanishing into the star-sprinkled sky. Dogs lay curled at thresholds, half asleep but alert, their ears twitching at every distant rustle. Somewhere in the dark, an owl hooted, slow, measured, eternal. Inside, people prepared for rest. Straw mattresses rustled as families settled beneath coarse wool blankets. The smell of the day, bread, smoke, soil, still lingered faintly in the air. Children fell asleep first, their breaths turning into the soft rhythm of dreams. Adults lingered longer, staring into the last glowing embers, their minds drifting over tomorrow's tasks, the ploughing, the herding, the endless but steady duties of life. Silence grew thick. The only sound was the faint crackle of dying wood, the occasional creak of beams, the sigh of the wind against the roof. Time slowed, then dissolved. Night wasn't just darkness, it was a blanket, a vast pause covering the village. And so, in the stillness, life surrendered to sleep. Every heartbeat in every house aligned with the heartbeat of the earth itself, steady and slow, as if the whole world had agreed. Enough for today. Rest now, and so the village slept. Beneath the same stars that had watched over countless generations, people lay wrapped in warmth, their dreams weaving silently into the fabric of the night. The fields rested, the rivers hushed, the forest stood watch, and the world turned slowly, patiently, as it always had. Sleep was not an escape, it was a return to the rhythm older than memory, where every breath echoed the wind in the trees, every heartbeat matched the steady pulse of the earth. The day's noise had ended, the tasks were done, and what remained was the quiet truth, that life, in its simplicity, was whole. The past may seem distant, but in these moments, when the fire fades, when the night embraces, when silence teaches us peace, we are not so different from those who lived centuries ago. Their lives moved slower, their days were measured by sun and season, but their need for rest, for stories, for belonging was the same as ours. So let the night take you as it took them. Let the ancient rhythm lull you. Close your eyes, let the stars keep watch, and drift into that same timeless sleep where generations before you once found peace. Because in the end, history is not just dates and battles. It is the quiet heartbeat of people who lived, dreamed, and slept, just like you.